Glenn Greenwald leaned back in his chair, voice dripping with contempt as he fired off his jab. "Congresswoman Crockett," he said with a mocking smile, "you've made a career out of shouting, but when it comes to substance, you're little more than noise. Isn't it time you admitted that?" His words weren't just a question. They were a provocation, sharpened like a blade meant to cut in front of cameras and an eager audience. The air shifted instantly. Viewers at home and those watching live could feel it, a sneer disguised as journalism, arrogance masquerading as inquiry. He wanted the headline. He wanted the clip of Crockett looking rattled, searching for words. He wanted her to play into his hands. But Jasmine Crockett didn't flinch. Her eyes locked onto Greenwald with a look so sharp it froze the room. For a heartbeat, silence filled the space, the kind of silence that makes everyone lean forward, holding their breath. Then with calm precision, she let her retort land. "Glenn," she said evenly, her voice steady yet carrying the weight of authority. "Men like you have mistaken confidence for chaos your whole lives. What you call noise is the sound of a community refusing to be ignored. And if that bothers you, maybe it's not my volume that's the problem. It's your inability to listen." Gasps rippled through the room. Commentators shifted in their seats. Even through the camera lens, it was clear. This wasn't the exchange Greenwald had scripted in his head. His smirk faltered, his eyes narrowed, but the damage was already done. Crockett hadn't just parried his insult. She had reframed it, turned his sneer into a mirror exposing his own arrogance. And then came the moment that sealed it. Crockett leaned forward, her tone tightening with unshakable certainty. "You asked if it's time I admitted something? I'll admit this. I came here knowing you'd try to belittle me. What you didn't know is that I don't scare easily. So if you think your mockery is going to silence me, you're about to learn how wrong you are." The chamber erupted, not in noise, but in stunned stillness. The energy was palpable, as if the entire world had paused, waiting for what she would say next. What she said next silenced the entire room. The clash between Glenn Greenwald and Jasmine Crockett was never just about one cutting remark or one fiery comeback. Beneath the surface, it represented something larger, something simmering in the heart of American discourse, the eternal tug-of-war between media figures who wield influence through narrative and public servants who bear the responsibility of representing communities, often silenced or caricatured. Greenwald came armed not only with words but with a posture, the insinuation that his commentary held more weight than Crockett's lived reality or her elected duty. That imbalance was the true battlefield. For Crockett, the stakes could not have been higher. Every syllable, every pause, every flash of expression was more than personal pride. It was about dignity, not just her own, but the dignity of those she represented. Black women in politics have too often been forced to fight battles on two fronts, proving their competence while defending their right to even stand on the stage. Crockett knew Greenwald's mocking tone was not simply aimed at her. It was a reflection of the dismissive lens too often turned toward women of color in power. That's what made the moment electric. Millions watching did not just see a politician and a journalist sparring. They saw a proxy war over truth, narrative, and control. Greenwald's role as a journalist had historically been to challenge power, but in this exchange, his mockery exposed another side, a commentator who relished belittling those he underestimated. Crockett's role, however, was not to bend under that weight. It was to remind viewers, and Greenwald himself, that words could wound, but they could also liberate. The audience sensed it instantly. This was not a trivial spat. This was about who gets to define reality in the public square. Would the loud, mocking voice of a media veteran drown out a rising figure who carried the hopes of marginalized voices? Or would dignity, rooted in authenticity and resilience, prove stronger than arrogance masquerading as wit? For Crockett, it wasn't enough to parry insults. She had to stand as a symbol of integrity against dismissal, of clarity against distortion. Her answer had to do more than respond. It had to resonate. And that pressure paradoxically became her power. Because when the stakes are high, every second of silence, every carefully chosen word, lands with the weight of history. And so, as Glenn leaned further into his taunts, confident in his authority, the energy shifted. The room seemed to hold its breath. Something in Crockett's demeanor, unshaken, steady, ready, signaled that the story was about to turn. And just when Greenwald thought he had control, the atmosphere shifted. Glenn Greenwald built his career on sharp edges. He was the journalist who prided himself on cutting through hypocrisy with the precision of a blade, leaving his targets bleeding from words alone. For years, he thrived in the role of the disruptor, the contrarian voice that unsettled the establishment and mocked its sacred cows. His reputation was forged not merely in reporting facts, but in dressing them with ridicule, with a sneer that told audiences he wasn't just exposing power, he was smarter than it. That style became his signature. Greenwald rarely engaged in debate without weaving mockery into his sentences. Whether on cable news panels, op-eds, or social media feeds, he carried the posture of a man who enjoyed turning the spotlight, not just on others' contradictions, but on his own ability to puncture them with sarcasm. His barbs were remembered as much for their sting as for their substance. To some, it made him fearless. To others, it made him arrogant. Over the years, he leaned into controversy like a performer feeding on applause. He knew outrage could amplify his voice louder than agreement ever would. Critics called him a provocateur, a man addicted to chaos, thriving on the very divisions he claimed to analyze. Supporters insisted he was simply braver than the rest, willing to speak truths others wouldn't dare. But both camps agreed on one thing. Glenn Greenwald never walked into a debate expecting to lose. His tactics followed a familiar rhythm. He mocked his opponents, cornered them with rhetorical traps, and framed their discomfort as evidence of weakness. It wasn't enough to prove someone wrong. He needed them humiliated. And in a media environment where viral moments mattered more than context, those tactics often worked. Clips of his sharpest put-downs spread quickly, cementing the image of Greenwald as a man untouchable by the very figures he scorned. But arrogance has a way of curdling into blindness. Somewhere along the way, Greenwald began mistaking ridicule for truth itself. His sneer became less a tool for revealing hypocrisy and more a mask for it. Where once his sharpness illuminated, it now often obscured. And while many of his rivals came prepared to joust with his wit, Greenwald had grown so accustomed to dominating with dismissive laughter and sarcasm that he underestimated those who stood across from him. That miscalculation is what made his encounter with Jasmine Crockett so fateful. He looked at her and saw an easy target, politician who, in his mind, was still new enough, still raw enough, to be thrown off balance by his ridicule. He saw a chance not just to challenge her, but to reduce her, to turn her presence into a punchline. But Greenwald misread the moment. Crockett wasn't simply another adversary to be mocked on live broadcast. She was the embodiment of communities long tired of mockery being weaponized against them. She had heard dismissiveness before, had endured the sneers of those who assumed her voice carried less weight because of who she was and what she represented. And unlike others, she was not walking into this debate merely to defend herself. She was prepared to confront the very tactic Greenwald had turned into his brand. What he believed was a show of strength, his ability to belittle, revealed itself in this moment as his greatest weakness. Because arrogance, once exposed, unravels quickly. It only takes one well-aimed strike to puncture the illusion, to reveal that ridicule is not substance, that mockery is not argument, and that confidence without humility is simply fragility, waiting to collapse. Greenwald's downfall didn't begin with Crockett's response. It began with his overconfidence. The instant he underestimated her, the story's arc had already shifted. He leaned forward, ready to bask in another viral clip of his own cleverness, unaware that this time the clip would belong to her. But Crockett wasn't facing a journalist. She was facing an idea that needed dismantling. Jasmine Crockett's story was never one of privilege handed down. It was carved out of persistence, long nights, and a stubborn refusal to accept that the odds were immovable. She came from beginnings that didn't guarantee a seat at any table, let alone one in Congress. Her path was the kind forged in communities where resources were scarce, but determination ran deep, where every achievement felt less like a step forward and more like a climb uphill. From an early age, Crockett learned that justice wasn't abstract. It was personal. She watched friends, neighbors, and family members navigate a system that didn't always see them. A system that too often assumed guilt before innocence, silence before voice. That awareness hardened her resolve. Education became her weapon of choice, and she wielded it fiercely. Law school wasn't simply a credential. It was an act of rebellion against the narratives that told her people they were powerless. Her early years as an attorney were defined by fire in the courtroom. Crockett didn't represent the wealthy or the comfortable. She represented the overlooked. She took on cases others turned down, standing beside clients who couldn't afford sleek defense teams or polished advocates. What she offered wasn't just legal counsel but dignity. For her, every case was a reminder that justice wasn't supposed to belong to the privileged few. It was a right owed to all. And when she stood before a judge, she wasn't just speaking for one client, but for an entire community demanding fairness. But her calling was never confined to the courtroom. Crockett saw how systemic barriers extended far beyond individual cases. She realized that laws themselves could perpetuate inequality just as much as biased rulings could. That realization pushed her into politics, first as a state legislator, and then onto the national stage. She didn't arrive in Congress with the polish of career politicians who had been groomed for the role. She arrived with grit, with unflinching candor, and with a voice that refused to be silenced. Congress quickly learned that Jasmine Crockett was not one to blend quietly into the background. Her reputation for fire and fearlessness spread rapidly. In hearings, she sparred with opponents who underestimated her, unafraid to expose hypocrisy or call out injustice directly to their faces. What others softened into diplomatic language, Crockett delivered with blunt clarity. That honesty made her polarizing to some but magnetic to many, especially those who were tired of seeing leaders shrink under pressure. Her rise wasn't smooth, though. Every step forward came with resistance. As a black woman in politics, she encountered dismissiveness, coded insults, and outright disrespect. Experiences designed to remind her that the halls of power weren't built for people like her. But Crockett wore those attacks as armor. Each attempt to belittle her only sharpened her resolve. Each sneer only fueled her conviction. Instead of dimming her presence, the hostility made her voice ring louder. What set her apart wasn't just her ability to confront adversaries. It was the way she carried the weight of her community into every exchange. She knew her victories weren't hers alone. When she spoke on the floor of Congress or in interviews, or in the middle of a tense confrontation, she spoke with the knowledge that countless people, immigrants, working families, women, marginalized voices, were listening for proof that someone, somewhere, was willing to fight for them without compromise. It was this combination, resilience forged in struggle, sharpened by law, emboldened by politics, that made her more than a rising politician. She became a symbol of what it meant to face adversity without bending. To her supporters, she was the embodiment of hope, proof that power could look like them, sound like them, and fight for them. To her critics, she was infuriatingly untamed, unwilling to bow to decorum when injustice was staring her in the face. By the time Jasmine Crockett entered the clash with Greenwald, she was not just a congresswoman sparring with a journalist. She was a veteran of countless battles, in courtrooms, in legislatures, in public discourse. She carried scars, yes, but also wisdom. She knew what it meant to be dismissed, and what it meant to turn that dismissal into defiance. She had faced worse than sneers, worse than ridicule, and she had walked away stronger every time. So when Greenwald leaned into mockery, he wasn't confronting a novice unsure of herself. He was stepping into the path of a woman who had been forged by fire, someone who had weathered storms meant to silence her, and emerged louder, prouder, and unbreakable. And it was precisely these experiences that prepared her for Greenwald's attack. The air thickened as Greenwald leaned forward, his eyes narrowing with that trademark glint of superiority. His voice carried the edge of sarcasm, the kind sharpened not to illuminate but to wound. He let the words hang deliberately, mocking her credentials, questioning her grasp of the issues, framing her as nothing more than a loud political figure in search of relevance. His tone was less inquiry and more indictment, less journalism and more theater. A performance crafted for maximum sting, But Jasmine Crockett didn't flinch. She didn't rush to interrupt, didn't let the venom spill her into anger. Instead, she sat straighter, her gaze fixed on him with a stillness that unsettled. In that silence, tension built like a storm cloud. Greenwald mistook her restraint for weakness, as if his barbs were landing without resistance. He smirked, emboldened, and pressed harder. "Congresswoman," he said with a sneer, "do you even understand the consequences of the positions you defend? Or is this just about grandstanding for cameras and applause?" The words dripped with derision, designed to reduce her to a caricature. Viewers watching live could almost feel the split beginning to form. On one side, Greenwald's loyalists cheered his sharpness, praising his refusal to bow to political correctness. On the other, Crockett's supporters leaned forward in frustration, their hearts pounding as they willed her to respond, to crush the arrogance they saw unfolding. Social media buzzed in real time. Hashtags started to take shape, memes already drafted in the minds of digital spectators. The clash was no longer just words between two people. It was a proxy war between values. Greenwald sensed the moment and poured gasoline on it. He rattled off past controversies layered in barbed jokes and interrupted whenever Crockett attempted to speak. His tactic was clear: overwhelm, belittle, dominate the frame. The more aggressive he became, the more the crowd tilted, eager to see whether Crockett would break under the relentless pressure or rise to match it. Yet through it all, Crockett's composure never cracked. She adjusted her posture, exhaled slowly, and allowed him to spin deeper into his own performance. Each jab, each sarcastic quip, only magnified the contrast between them. His aggression versus her calm, his bluster versus her steady focus. The longer she waited, the more his overconfidence grew, and the more the tension escalated. People watching could feel the stakes sharpening. This wasn't just about a congresswoman defending her ideas against a journalist's critique. It was about dignity standing against derision, about truth holding its ground against a performance built on sneers. The moment pulsed with anticipation, like a coiled spring waiting to snap. And in that coiling tension, everyone sensed something extraordinary was about to happen. But Crockett hadn't even begun to fight back. For several long moments, Jasmine Crockett allowed Glenn Greenwald to bask in his own spotlight. He darted from one insult to the next, weaving ridicule into the fabric of his argument, as though derision itself was proof of his superiority. Every pause he took carried the smugness of a man convinced the audience was firmly in his pocket. And for a brief while he seemed to believe he had won, that Crockett's silence meant surrender. But then she shifted. It was subtle at first. A small lean toward the microphone, a calmness etched into her expression that contrasted so starkly with his fevered arrogance. When she finally spoke, her voice cut through the air with measured precision. Not raised, not rushed, steady, controlled. "Undeniable, Mr. Greenwald," she began, her tone laced with an almost surgical poise. "You seem to confuse volume with validity. But let's separate the theater from the truth, shall we?" The room grew still. Her words didn't attack his character directly, but they dismantled the foundation of his performance. And before Greenwald could interject, she launched her slow-burn counterstrike. He had mocked her education. She responded by citing her years in law, not as boastful resume building, but as lived experience defending those without power. Each sentence reframed his sneer into evidence of his own blindness. He had ridiculed her policy positions. She recited facts, statistics, real-world consequences that his generalizations couldn't withstand. Every figure she dropped was like a stone placed carefully into a balance, and the weight was tipping. The audience shifted. Gasps escaped here and there as her rebuttal sliced through his narrative. Murmurs rippled across the crowd when she connected his dismissive tone to the broader issue: how journalists sometimes exploit their platform not to inform, but to belittle. The silence that followed was not emptiness. It was awe. Greenwald's confidence faltered. He tried to interrupt, his voice sharper, faster now, as though speed could undo what substance had already accomplished. But Crockett refused to be rattled. She would wait for him to finish, then calmly dismantle his points with logic and wit so sharp it drew invisible blood. When he claimed she was too emotional to lead, she paused. Then, with a raised brow, she replied, "If demanding dignity is emotional, Then I'll take emotion over your mockery any day. At least emotion means I care about people, not just about winning arguments. The line landed like a thunderclap. The room erupted, half with applause, half with stunned silence. Greenwald chuckled nervously, attempting to pivot, but Crockett was no longer on defense. She had taken the floor and the momentum. Her counterattack wasn't merely reactive. It was transformative. She shifted the frame of the entire exchange. This wasn't a journalist holding a politician accountable. It was a politician holding a journalist accountable for his arrogance. Point by point, she reduced his sarcasm to rubble. Every time he leaned on ridicule, she responded with clarity. Every time he exaggerated, she grounded the discussion in facts. And every time he tried to humiliate her, she reframed the humiliation back onto him. It was a masterclass in turning the energy of an opponent's attack against them. The crowd was captivated. Phones glowed as people live-tweeted her lines. Hashtags exploded, videos clipped in real time. Somewhere beyond that room, millions of viewers began to realize they were watching not just a debate, but a moment destined to go viral. The kind of clip replayed endlessly as proof of what happens when arrogance collides with unshakable resolve. Greenwald's composure unraveled before their eyes. His smirk became forced, his interjections more frantic. He leaned back in his chair, then forward again, desperate to reclaim control. But each attempt only highlighted the imbalance. Crockett was in command, and he was spiraling. Then came the emotional crescendo. She leaned forward, her voice steady yet carrying the weight of history behind it. You mock my story, Glenn, because you've never had to fight for yours. You ridicule my presence here because women like me, black, bold, unapologetic, make you uncomfortable. But I'm not here to make you comfortable. I'm here to tell the truth. And the truth is, your sneers don't change facts and your arrogance won't erase justice. The room gasped. The silence afterward was thick, palpable. Every eye was on Greenwald, but he had no words. His confidence, once towering, now looked brittle. And then, with one final stroke, Crockett delivered the line that sealed the moment. The mic drop heard across every platform. So if your best weapon is mockery, Glenn, then consider this your defeat. Because tonight, your ridicule just ridiculed itself. The audience erupted. Applause, cheers, murmurs of disbelief filled the space. Some laughed in sheer astonishment at the precision of the blow. Others sat in reverent silence, aware they had just witnessed a moment that would be replayed again and again in political history. And with just one line, she turned mockery into humiliation. The moment Jasmine Crockett delivered her final line, it was as if the air itself carried the shockwaves beyond the room. Phones were already out, screens glowing, fingers flying across keyboards. Within minutes, hashtags ignited like wildfire. Jew, Crockett clapback, Greenwald owned, mic drop moment. The digital world thrives on moments that can be clipped, replayed, and captioned. And Crockett had just handed it a masterpiece. On X, the clip spread with the speed of lightning. One user posted, "I just witnessed history. Crockett didn't just win, she obliterated Greenwald." Another quote tweeted the video with a simple caption, "This is why you don't mess with Jasmine." By the hour's end, millions had seen it. By morning, tens of millions on TikTok, with its thirst for sound bites and reenactments, turned her words into trending audios. Young creators lip-synced her mic drop line, splicing it over scenes of victory in their own lives. Finishing exams, quitting bad jobs, standing up to bullies. It wasn't just political anymore. It was cultural. Crockett's clapback became shorthand for resilience and dignity in the face of arrogance. YouTube followed suit, flooded with reaction videos. Political commentators paused every sentence, breaking down the brilliance of her delivery. Some replayed Greenwald's unraveling frame by frame, savoring the moment his smirk cracked. Titles blared across thumbnails. Crockett destroys Greenwald. The moment Glenn knew it was over. This clip will live forever. The ripple effect was impossible to ignore. News anchors opened their broadcasts not with war updates or policy debates, but with Crockett's exchange. Pundits sparred on cable. Was this the future of political discourse, or a dangerous new level of humiliation politics? Celebrities chimed in. One actor tweeted, Crockett just gave us the political equivalent of a knockout punch. A famous musician posted a clip of her line on Instagram with the caption, "Mood for 2025. Even those who had little interest in politics found themselves swept into the conversation. Memes mushroomed. Someone edited Crockett's retort into a Marvel-style trailer, with booming sound effects and Greenwald fading into dust. Another mashed it up with sports highlights, sinking her words with a slam dunk. Humor, admiration, and sheer astonishment fused into a cultural wave. And in that wave, audiences didn't just feel like spectators, they felt like participants. Sharing the clip became a badge of solidarity, a declaration that they, too, stood against arrogance and belittlement. For progressives, immigrants, and those long accustomed to being mocked or dismissed, Crockett's moment was more than entertainment. It was validation. Every retweet, every like, every repost carried the weight of, "I see myself in this." I refused to be silenced. Of course, backlash stirred too. Greenwald's defenders attempted to reframe the exchange, arguing that Crockett had overreacted, that the crowd had been unfair. But their voices were drowned in the tide of clips replayed with thunderous applause. The overwhelming narrative had already crystallized. Crockett had not just survived Greenwald's assault. She had turned it into his undoing. The echo chambers of cable news and podcasts amplified the frenzy. Some conservative outlets framed her as emotional grandstanding, but their own panels couldn't deny the virality. The clip dominated the week, overshadowing legislative debates, scandals, even international headlines. Greenwald himself, usually quick with a rebuttal, grew conspicuously quiet. His silence in the face of her words became yet another meme. And so the shockwaves rolled on. Every share pulled new viewers into the current. Every commentator who analyzed her poise extended the lifespan of the clip. This was not just another political spat. It was a viral confrontation that etched itself into the cultural bloodstream. But beneath the laughter and applause, something deeper stirred. For many, Crockett's victory was a reminder that dignity, when wielded with precision, has a power mockery cannot match. People weren't just entertained, they were inspired. They wanted to carry that energy into their own lives, to stand taller, to speak louder, to answer arrogance with truth. The room had been silenced in the moment. The internet had exploded in the aftermath. But beyond the hashtags and the headlines, something larger was beginning to take shape. Because this wasn't just about Crockett versus Greenwald. It was about every voice that had ever been mocked, every story ever belittled, every moment where arrogance tried to drown out truth. And now the world was watching to see what that lesson would mean next. When the storm of laughter, applause, and viral commentary began to settle, Jasmine Crockett's words remained. They weren't just a retort to a journalist's taunt. They became a mirror reflecting something larger back to the nation. In that clash, Crockett had transformed Greenwald's arrogance into a teaching moment. His sneer was temporary. Her composure was lasting. The beauty of that instant wasn't in the humiliation of a rival, but in the triumph of dignity. Crockett didn't match mockery with mockery. She didn't let anger drown her truth. Instead, she showed that the sharpest weapon against ridicule isn't more ridicule. It's clarity, calm, and conviction. The world had seen 1,000 shouting matches before, but this moment was different. She didn't win because she was louder. She won because she was stronger, and that strength told a story anyone could understand. Cheap shots are easy. They cost nothing but pride. Dignity, though, costs effort, discipline, and self-respect. Requires the courage to hold steady when others try to drag you down into the mud. Crockett's refusal to flinch proved that dignity is not weakness. It's power in its purest form. For progressives, immigrants, women, and all those whose voices have so often been dismissed, the lesson was clear. When mockery rises, you don't need to meet it on its terms. You rise above it. You meet arrogance with justice. You meet dismissal with truth. You meet cruelty with composure that leaves the world remembering your strength long after the insult is forgotten. Crockett's confrontation became a metaphor for more than politics. It resonated in workplaces where employees faced condescension, in classrooms where students endured ridicule, in families where voices went unheard. It whispered to anyone who had ever been told to stay in their place, that there is power in refusing to bow. What happened on that stage wasn't just one woman's victory. It was proof of what happens when resilience outshines arrogance. Justice doesn't shout to be heard. It stands firm. Truth doesn't beg for attention. It demands it by its very nature. And dignity, that quiet, steady force, always outlasts the noise. The irony is that Greenwald, who prided himself on commanding attention, ended up forgotten in the very exchange he tried to dominate. Crockett, the target of his mockery, emerged as the voice remembered. His ridicule evaporated the moment it left his lips. Her words endured, echoing through millions of screens and hearts. This is the legacy of dignity. It cannot be mocked into silence. It cannot be erased by arrogance. It does not need to fight dirty to win. It wins because people recognize its truth and carry it forward. Crockett's closing line, sharp yet poised, became more than a soundbite. It became a mantra. When voices of mockery rise, the answer is not silence. It's strength, and that strength is available to anyone who chooses it, because in the end, this wasn't simply about Greenwald versus Crockett. It was about a universal battle that plays out every day. Arrogance trying to eclipse justice, mockery trying to smother truth, dismissal trying to silence dignity. What Crockett showed the world is that these forces can be met and overcome, not with anger or insults, but with an unshakable belief in one's own worth. Her story is a reminder that history does not remember the jeers. It remembers the courage. It does not celebrate the sneers. It celebrates the voices that refuse to be bowed. And so, this moment became more than a viral clash. It became a parable for our times, a warning to those who mistake arrogance for power, a promise to those who carry dignity in their hearts. Because long after the hashtags fade, long after the trending clips are buried beneath tomorrow's headlines, the lesson will remain. Strength of character will always outshine mockery. Truth will always outlast arrogance. Justice will always triumph over cruelty. And for Jasmine Crockett, that single exchange etched her into memory not as someone who endured an insult, but as someone who transformed it into proof that dignity, once revealed, can never be silenced. Glenn Greenwald thought he could mock Jasmine Crockett into silence. He thought a sneer, a sarcastic jab, and an air of superiority would shake her. But in an instant, Crockett proved him wrong. With a calm gaze and a razor-sharp reply, she turned arrogance into ashes and left the world talking. That's what this clash was really about. Not just words traded in the heat of a debate, but a revelation. Insults fade, but dignity lasts. Greenwald's attempt at dominance crumbled the moment Crockett spoke her truth. And in that instant, the balance shifted, reminding us all that power built on ridicule is fragile, while power rooted in justice and self-respect endures. Moments like these matter because they reveal something deeper about our culture. We live in a time where mockery is easy, where arrogance is loud, where insults dominate headlines. But Crockett showed a different path, that courage, composure, and clarity still have the power to stop arrogance in its tracks. And that's why this moment will be remembered, not for Greenwald's sneer, but for Crockett's strength. Not for the insult, but for the response that turned it into history. If you believe in that strength, if you believe that dignity should always triumph over arrogance, that truth should always outshine cheap shots, then don't just watch. Be part of it, like this video. Share it with someone who needs the reminder that resilience beats ridicule. Subscribe to this channel and join the growing community that refuses to let arrogance define the story. Because this fight isn't just Crockett's. It's all of ours. And together we can make sure that the voices of dignity will never be silenced.